welcome to the next episode of Brandland. I'm your host, Garrett Justice, and today I am going to do a special episode. So instead of having a guest on today, I am actually just going to share some thoughts that have just been top of mind for me. And so today I really want to talk to you about positioning. One of my favorite things about marketing is positioning. And part of that is because positioning, in my opinion, is so closely tied to business strategy. And that's just something that is so interesting to me. I'm very much a generalist marketer, and I feel like some of my passions kind of lie in that business strategy. And so that's why I want to talk to you today about positioning and some resources that I have found that have really helped me learn how to do positioning well. Something else that I want to point out before we kind of jump into that is I think positioning is really closely tied to branding, and hence why I want to talk about it today. If you've listened to any episodes of Brandland in the past, you know that the premise of this podcast is really just about building strong brands and how do you do that. And I think positioning is so key to that. And so many companies struggle to get positioning right because it's hard to do and it's hard to implement. So I want to share some resources today that will hopefully be helpful for all of you out there. Before we jump into that, I want to share a little bit more about how I feel like positioning ties into branding. So when I think about positioning is like the rational. It's the expression of the company's strategy in precise phrases that really can convey how you're different, your role in the marketplace, and why you should be relevant to the customers that you're serving. On the other side, branding, it's like the yin and the yang, if you will. So positioning on one side, branding on the other. Branding is the emotional, in opposite of that rational of positioning. Branding is really the emotional. It's the expression of your company's strategy. In the words, in the tones, in the colors, in the design, in the imagery and illustrations that you put out there to the world. And I think both are important to do really strong marketing and build really strong brands. When you talk about positioning, though, too, it's also about sacrifice. It's about what is your role and your relevance right now in the near term. And that's how you describe it. It may or may not really describe the long-term vision of your company. Some branding might describe the long-term vision. So you can see how these two things work together. The other thing I would note about positioning is that positioning can and probably should evolve over time. If you think about, some big name brands out there, Amazon, for example, how did Amazon start? Well, their initial positioning was about, selling online books, right? They were a book retailer, and they've since expanded that to be selling everything under the sun online, right? Facebook started really as a social network for college students, but again, has now the world's largest social network. So positioning can and should evolve over time. Some of those core brand principles about who you are as your brand or your vision for the world may not evolve over time. And so it's important to realize that how these different things work together. So again, I want to share a few frameworks that have helped me really understand this better and help me craft good positioning in the past. I really love frameworks because I think that they help you see the world through a lens and organize chaos. And so here's some resources and frameworks that I want to talk a little bit more about. So the first is from Andy Cunningham. So you may or may not have heard of her. Andy Cunningham was Steve Jobs' right-hand marketing PR person for a long time. She's the owner of a consulting company called Cunningham Collective. She's also the author of a book called Get to Aha, and it's about positioning. I haven't actually read her book. I need to. It's on my list, but I have studied her framework a lot, and I've applied a lot of the principles in her framework that I know she outlines in that book. Her framework is really about helping you build brand and messaging architecture, and does a great job at that. The next framework that I want to talk a little bit more about today is from Patrick Lencioni. So Patrick Lencioni is an author. He's written lots of books that focus on business and team management. One of his more popular ones you may have heard of is The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. But he also wrote a book called The Advantage. The whole premise is that the last advantage that companies have today is what he describes as organizational health. Organizational health is about clarity. So he kind of describes a 4-step framework in the book, The Advantage, about step 1 is building a cohesive leadership team. Step 2 is creating clarity across your organization by answering, a couple questions similar to some of the things that Andy Cunningham talks about in her framework. And step 3 is about over communicating that clarity to the team. And 4 is like reinforcing that clarity in kind of the structure and framework of how you run the company. And so I like that that's more of like a team focused, how do you roll this out type framework that helps you think about positioning. And then the last one that I really enjoy is from Andy Raskin. We have 2 Andys here. Andy Raskin is a consultant in the Bay Area who focuses on helping companies come up with their strategic narrative. He's also the host of a podcast that I think is great that started earlier this year called The Bigger Narrative. You may have heard of Andy if you're familiar with and have done a lot of research into the positioning space, because he wrote a blog post a couple of years ago, or a Medium post, called The Greatest Sales Deck I've Ever Seen. And in that, he describes his 6-step or 5-step process for developing strategic narratives that he uses when he goes in to consult with companies. And so his process is, first step is name a big relevant change in the world. Next is show there'll be winners and losers as a result of that change that's happening in the world of your customers. You then tease the promised land or that ideal state that your customers want to get to, and then introduce features of your product or service as magic gifts for overcoming the obstacles to get to the promised land. And then lastly, you present evidence that you can make the story come true. And so the strategic narrative is really a way to, I think, kind of wrap up a lot of the strategy and share it out in that format. So those are some of the resources. I want to dive in and share some of the things that I've learned about positioning from each of these people and their frameworks. So first, from Andy Cunningham, from Cunningham Collective. So Andy Cunningham really has talked about how company DNA is core to your positioning. I think this is a big premise for her book. And she really thinks, that there are only 3 main types of companies out there. She calls them mothers, mechanics, and missionaries. Mother companies are the customer-centric companies where they win based on relationships with customers. So you think about Zappos or Nordstrom or other brands like that, where they're all about the customer. Mechanics are really the product-centric companies. They exist to build the best products and services and take them to the world. So think of Microsoft or GE or 3M, right? These are the mechanic companies. And then lastly, the missionary companies. These are concept-centric companies. They win based on creative vision or direction, and they exist to really make a change in the world. So you think of Salesforce and how visionary they were from the get-go, or you think of Tesla, right? Or SpaceX. These are very missionary or concept-driven companies. So, Andy kind of talks about these 3, and there's different implications for what your positioning is and what you do as a company based on what your core DNA is. It's really based on who are you as a company at your core, right? So there's different implications for success metrics and how you judge success as a company. If you're, a mother company or customer-centric company, you're going to probably focus a lot more on, your NPS score or customer satisfaction. If you're a product-centric mechanic type company, you're going to focus on the market share that you have or category leadership or being number 1 in the space that you serve. If you're missionary or concept focused company, it's about thought leadership and buzz and kind of getting the name out there. So there's different metrics, different strategic and tactical implementations of that. So I really like that, because that's helped me think about, who are we as a company at our core, and that helps tie into your positioning. From the next resource, Patrick Lencioni, and his book, The Advantage. I really like that his framework that he spells out in The Advantage makes positioning actionable. Often I think positioning falls apart when you try and roll it out to your org or try to get buy-in from other leaders at your company. And so I like that his framework really focuses on that. So again, he had a 4-step framework. The first step was building a cohesive leadership team. Before you even jump into this, you have to make sure that there's a cohesive leadership team. People understand their role as part of that. There's mutual trust there. They understand the importance of being able to define this strategy or positioning. And then his next step is creating clarity. And part of creating clarity is answering 6 questions. And these are similar questions to what Andy Cunningham has in her framework also. But the 6 questions that he outlines to help create clarity for your organization are: 1, why do we exist? 2, how do we behave? 3, what do we do? A simple explanation of that. 4 is, how will we succeed? 5 is, what is most important right now? And then 6 is, who must do what? So that's step 2 of his framework. Once you have defined that, it's about over communicating clarity to the team. And he talks about being able to develop a playbook that answers these questions for your team. And we followed this framework. About maybe 2.5 years ago for Lucidpress, we had a young team. Owen Fuller had recently joined as our general manager, or kind of the CEO of Lucidpress. We developed this kind of cohesive leadership team, read this book, The Advantage, together, and tried to answer these questions. And then we rolled that out to the rest of our team using this playbook format, where we would create a quarterly version of that playbook that just kind of updated some of the questions, especially the ones like, what's most important right now? And it was great in helping bring alignment. And we used that for about a year and a half. And we felt like, it was perfect for the size we were at then, and we've kind of outgrown it since then and moved on to some other things. But a lot of those principles are still really important to what we do. So that's the 3rd step in his 4-step framework: over communicate. And then last is reinforcing clarity. And so that's really about, how do you ingrain this in the fabric of your company and your culture, into the recruiting and hiring? How do you make people understand, not make them, but help them really understand the answers to these questions to create clarity, even through the recruiting or hiring process, or, performance management, or how you compensate people or reward people or recognize people. How do you ingrain that clarity into all the different fabrics of your org? So I think that, again, I really like this framework and this approach, because it makes positioning more actionable. It's how you take it out there once you do the hard part of figuring out what is your positioning, right? And then the last one I really like is, again, Andy Raskin. And so his framework is about developing a strategic narrative. I really like that Andy's framework is about creating the story that you tell to the world, to your employees, to your customers. I think that, as marketers, as brand builders, as creatives, we know already inherently that people are wired to just understand stories. So that's how people are going to remember your positioning, is when you can share it out in a story format that people really understand. There's a quote from Ben Horowitz, who's a partner and founder at Andreessen Horowitz, one of the large venture capitalist companies. And he says that company story is the company strategy. So again, it kind of goes back to positioning. Developing your story and your framework is really about company strategy. And that's one of the things I love about this so much. It takes a cross-functional effort. This is not just a marketing activity to do positioning and branding really, really well. It takes buy-in from everyone. So Andy Raskin's framework for developing this strategic narrative there's a few steps to it. His first step, again, like I mentioned before, is name a big relevant change happening in the world. Step 2 is show that there'll be winners and losers as a result of this change. Step 3 is tease the promised land. Step 4 is introduce your features of your product or service as magic gifts for overcoming the obstacles that your customers might face in getting to that promised land. And then just present evidence that your brand can make the story come true. And so using these resources, I've been able to develop some great frameworks for Lucidpress, based on well, I guess based on these frameworks, I've been able to develop, really useful resources to help us hone in our positioning. So the first is our strategic narrative. So we have a strategic narrative that really fuels all marketing and sales messaging. It's about a change that we've seen happening, a real change that we've seen happening in the world of our customers, that we call it the content economy, right? Where content now fuels every aspect of the customer journey and the impacts of that downstream. And I think that has just been key for us in being able to cohesively go to market and have a story to tell that makes sense, that helps resonate with our customers. The next resource that we've kind of developed, again, based on a lot of these frameworks, is our brand and messaging framework. It's similar to what Andy Cunningham works on with her clients and what she talks about in her framework and in her book. But we have kind of done a little bit of a mashup of we've pulled some of Andy Cunningham's framework, some of Patrick Lencioni's, and some from other places. And so our brand and messaging framework is really like the positioning and branding elements together. And that kind of is key for especially our marketing team, but our entire org to understand, because it helps shape and fuel all the other types of materials and messaging that we create. So some elements of our brand and messaging framework are, first, we define our vision for the world. It's about, it's answering the question, we're building a world where ... right? And so we've outlined that for Lucidpress. And most of these things, I would say too, are internal facing. We don't share a lot of these externally. Occasionally we will. It's not something that's secretive, but really this framework is not meant to be shared externally. It's meant to provide clarity for the team to understand how do we bring elements of that through different mediums out to the world. So first is that vision. Next, we define our mission, or why do we exist, or our core purpose of existence. And I think that that's a little bit different than the vision. The vision is more about how we see the world. And then our mission is like, what's our role in that? Next, we define what do we do? And this is just a clear, straightforward description of what our organization does. It's not meant to be, like sexy marketing lingo or anything like that. It's just clear and straightforward. What do we do? How can you describe what you do? Next is, how do we behave? And that's one of the questions from Patrick Lencioni's book as well. It's really about our core values. And so what are our core values as a company? In Lucid Software, we have core values that are key to how we behave. I think we've done a great job as a company organizing that. One of them is teamwork over ego, which we often talk about a lot, which is fuels, who we hire as a company. Talking about some of the things that Patrick Lencioni mentions in his book, The Advantage. Next step in our brand and messaging framework is our core DNA. So that kind of goes back to Andy Cunningham's framework of, are we customer centric, product centric, or concept centric? What really drives us at our core? Who are we in our DNA? The next piece is our brand driver. So now we're getting into, we've done some of the positioning elements of this framework, and now we're getting into the branding or emotional elements that help fuel the visual expression of a lot of what we do. And so our brand driver is really the most important core concept around which the brand is aligned. And so for us, that's about empowerment. We, as a brand, as a product, help empower anyone to be able to create on-brand, consistent content for Lucidpress, right? So that driver is that most important core concept. The next is our brand archetype. So those of you who've done branding work in the past, I think that there are 13 typical archetypes or dominant personality traits or characteristics that exist. All companies typically fall into one or a few of those archetypes. And so what's our most dominant characteristic and archetype there? And that kind of fuels the personality of our messaging and our visuals. The next is specifically personality, brand personality. So what are the human characteristics of our brand? If our brand was a person, what would those characteristics of our brand be? And that, again, helps fuel a lot of the messaging and visual identity. And then lastly, slightly different from personality is our brand attributes. And so the brand attributes are synonymous with our brand. Those are really reflecting how we want the brand or our product to be experienced And so you can see how that's slightly different than like personality traits. And so again, these resources from Andy Cunningham, from Patrick Lencioni, from Andy Raskin have really helped us, put together our strategic narrative and this brand and messaging framework that I just shared, and has been key in helping us hone in our positioning for Lucidpress. It's not perfect. It's always ongoing. And I think that the key piece of this is being able to revise and update as you learn more, as your company grows, as you evolve. But I think that positioning is such fun work to do and ties in so closely to building a strong brand. So I wanted to share these resources, these frameworks with you today. And hopefully there's something you can take and apply to your own businesses to help strengthen your own positioning. If you have any other questions about this in the future, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to share more about what we've done and some of the learnings along the way, and clarify any questions you might have about these frameworks. But hopefully this is helpful to you. And I hope you, wherever you're at, you have a safe and happy holiday season that we're in right now. And you can take some time to relax during this crazy end of this crazy year. Thank you for listening and being part of our podcast, and hope to see you next week.